In our previous video, we saw how there were different components of aggregate demand and how the roles of households and firms and government and so on contributed to the total level of aggregate demand. Now, we can see over on the right-hand side, over on this side of the chart here, we've got the different components. So we've got the household consumptions, that's the C. We've got the gross fixed capital formation, that's the proper title for investment in the macroeconomies, that's the I component. We've got the general government consumption expenditure, that's the G, the day-to-day government stuff, and then we've got the external balance on goods and services, that's the net trade position, the X minus the M. Now, the data that I've got here has come from some World Bank data from 2013. That's the most recent data set when I made this video, which covers a variety of different countries. And really want to just have a quick look here because it's important to understand that the different components have different importance within the AD. So a change in one might have a bigger overall impact in AD because that component is more important. So let's just have a look at, if we take us, but let's take the UK and the US to begin with. So if we just kind of look at these two economies here, because you'll see that the breakdown on these two economies is relatively similar. There are slight differences here, but they are relatively similar. And what you can see in both of these is that by far the largest proportion of aggregate demand, about 2/3 or so on in both of these countries, is the C aspect, which is the household final consumption. So it's important to remember when you're talking about aggregate demand, an important way to evaluate it is that any factor which is going to influence the level of household consumption is going to have a disproportionately big effect on aggregate demand within an economy. Now, see as well that if we look kind of towards the top here, then these two figures are slightly reversed. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that investment has a slightly larger importance to the US economy than to the UK, and the government expenditure is relatively more important in the UK than it is in the US. So, although, as we can see there, the figures are relatively similar. Now, down at the bottom here, you can see that there are negative little purple bars. And what that means is that both the United States and the United Kingdom run a deficit on the external balance of goods and services. What that means is we import more than we export. So there is a general flow of demand, I suppose, out of those economies because the people within those economies are demanding things from outside. Where are they demanding it from? Well, you're probably not be completely unsurprised to hear that China has a positive up on that aspect there. China, for quite a long period of time, although it is definitely changing now as we speak, has been quite a substantial net exporter. So their purple section is a positive on their economy. But you can see that there are massive differences between the economic structure in the UK and the US and that of, say, China, and to a slightly lesser extent India, where you can see that the investment, the red bar, is a much greater proportion of the total level of demand. So in China, the household consumption is less than 40%, or it was less than 40% in 2013. Much lower than the United States and the United Kingdom, but very high levels of investment. A lot of that was central government investment. So particularly kind of the construction of infrastructure, things like railways and things like that, made up that very big red bar for China. And again, you can see a similar sort of thing for India. India was more to do with communications infrastructure rather than transport, but a similar sort of arrangement. So the important thing to bear in mind here is normally when you talk about this, certainly in your first year of economics, you're mainly going to be looking at the UK. So when we're thinking about the UK, what you need to remember is that about 2/3 of the level of aggregate demand comes from household expenditure, and then you have about 15 to 20% from each of the government and capital investment sections of aggregate demand, and then there is a relatively small deficit on the external balance of goods and services. What we're going to do in the next slide then is, rather than looking at specific countries, look at types of countries and see how things change. This is more relevant, I suppose, in your second year of economics, where you start to look at development a little bit more, but it will be interesting to think about some of these things now. So here we've got basically the same type of chart, but rather than looking at individual countries, we're looking at income group classifications. These are the World Bank low, middle and high income brackets. Now, what we can see here is that there are quite clear differences between the GDP composition between these different income categories. We'll start over here on the right with the high income. Now, these obviously include the kind of the developed economies such as the UK and the USA from the previous slide, and you can see that actually the composition is, relatively speaking, quite similar to the UK and the USA, in that we've got a kind of a 2/3-ish, slightly less than here, 2/3-ish chunk of the GDP coming from household consumption, and then we have about 20% coming from the gross fixed capital formation, which, remember, is what we call investment. We've got a little bit less than that, 18.3% coming from the general government, that's the day-to-day expenditure, and then a slight positive on the external balance of goods and services. So that looks broadly the same. If we look at the middle income, now middle income includes the majority of countries, actually. Most countries are included in middle income. We're talking here about countries between just a little over $1,000 up to about $12,000 on GNI per capita. And what we can see here is that the structure is slightly different. These are countries that include places like India, China, Brazil, Russia now is in this category. And what we can see here is that the share of consumption is lower. So only just over half of GDP comes from consumption in these middle income economies. The government day-to-day expenditure figure is slightly lower. Trade is broadly the same, but what's different here is obviously the weighting between these two. So we can see in middle income economies, the investment, the gross fixed capital formation, tends to make up a greater proportion of GDP. Now, the reason that happens is that when an economy is in the middle income category, what we're hoping to see is that economy is starting to develop. It's maybe starting to become more involved in kind of industrial and manufacturing products. Those sorts of industries require an infrastructure, things like roads, railways, communication systems, and so on, as we said before. So that's what this larger chunk here is, the 30%. If we look at the low-income economies over here on the left, you can see now theirs looks very, very different. Firstly, obviously, it does go over 100 here, but that is cancelled out by the fact that they have such a big negative on the external balance of goods and services. So we'll start with that. So why do developing low-income economies tend to see a very substantial external deficit? Mainly because the things that they export, with a few exceptions, tend to be relatively low value, and they are requiring to import a lot of other what we kind of view as being relatively basic things in order to meet a reasonable standard of living. So what we see there are a few economies in that category, but not very many who have some kind of commodity wealth, although they tend to be in the middle income, but the low income economies tend not to have that, and so as a result of that, they don't have anything of great value to export, and they also tend to import relatively large amounts of things from other economies around the world. If we look at the rest of it, you can see that the government section is relatively low compared to the middle and high income. That may be for a number of reasons. Primarily, of course, in low-income countries, the government is going to be receiving very little in the way of tax revenue, and therefore it's going to be hard for them to generate much government spending, and it may also be difficult just for them to collect the tax revenue. We can see also that the investment is reasonably high. Hopefully that's going into developing infrastructure and so on that the economy can benefit from. But by far the largest proportion, more than 3/4 in 2014, was household consumption. And it's quite common in very low income economies to see individual household consumption actually being the driving force. Although the households have a low level of income, actually As far as the economy goes, they are still the driving force in terms of the amount of activity which is actually taking place. So we can see they're very different setup. In your first year of your A level, you will be talking mainly about economies that fit into this high income category over here. So try to remember that high income countries have about 60% of GDP from consumption, about 20 from investment, similar about 20 from government expenditure, and about 1% from external balance of goods and services. And that will give you a way of evaluating the relative importance of factors which affect each of those different components.